wealth, you're always going to have a kind of racially based inequality, because into our system of rights, into our system of private property, into our system of free exchange is embedded a racialist and really racially oppressive notion of whiteness. They're inseparable. They also think that some of those key constitutional pillars, or the key pillars of the Bill of Rights, such as free speech, encourages or allows racial domination. So you need to have really a regulator or a state power to suppress the speech of people who would use it to reinforce that system of racial domination. And even the 14th Amendment, and then but to a lesser extent the Civil Rights Act of 1964, they say no, a lot of hand waving. Derek Bell famously said that Lincoln didn't free the slaves in order to advance racial justice. And the 14th Amendment was really a kind of fake, a fake expression of equality, all the way leading up even to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, to desegregation. And so what do they want? They really want a focused state power. They look to, for example, the decolonial, post-colonial regimes in Africa that seized land and wealth and then redistributed it along racial lines. That was one of their inspirations in the 1990s. And so when you put all these elements together, you're really getting the end of the constitutional system. Because look, if you don't have free speech, you don't have individual rights, you don't have equal protection under the law.
Those are just all masks for power, as you pointed out. Okay, so let me make the counterclaim here for a minute, okay? And then we'll get into this in more detail. So I've read a fair bit of the 1619 Project book, a book actually I liked, and I was reviewing a fair bit of Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality before I interviewed you today. And so let me push back as hard as I can on this. So
Great.
The basic claim is that all of these institutions that are in some sense central to what has been described as the Western Enlightenment and also Judeo-Christian tradition, and put forth as a moral virtue, a set of truly moral guidelines, is actually nothing but a front for the domination of a small number of individuals who you can usually characterize by both race and gender. Race, gender, and sexual preference, let's say. So white heterosexual males. Now, it is the case that white heterosexual males occupy a disproportionate number of the most influential positions in society. It is also the case that racial minorities, and you could put sex minorities and sexual minorities in that same category, do tend to be overrepresented, let's say, at the bottom of the heap. And it is also the case that people who have positions of authority and power are likely to harness whatever they can philosophically and theologically, let's say, to buttress their claim that their occupation of those positions of power, authority, and privilege are justified not only on pragmatic grounds, because they fought, let's say, fair or unfairly for what they have, but also on moral grounds. And so why isn't it acceptable to swallow the radical leftist critique wholeheartedly and say, look, if you're not naive and you do know that power can corrupt, and that power does corrupt, and that many of our institutions are corrupt, and that merit isn't the only basis upon which people progress, that it's reasonable to view the entire history, let's say, of Western civilization as the attempt to merely dominate and to use very elaborate structures of rationalization to provide a moral framework for nothing but that dominance. That's basically the argument. So what's wrong with that argument?
Sure. Well, I mean, if we kind of take a step back, in some ways I'm somewhat sympathetic to it. If you look at the history of civilizations, obviously a lot of the principles proposed or espoused by leading figures are rationalizations. There's a certain truth to that. This stuff is not totally bogus or totally out of left field. But the question is, okay, let's actually get down to the implementation. Let's get down into the practical unfolding of this historical experience. You start from a starting point, let's say around the American founding, where human slavery, for example, was a universal throughout space and time up until that point. And the Declaration of Independence was a radical egalitarian document, an attempt to raise human civilization up from a kind of morass, up from a kind of world of where this kind of domination was accepted. Did they transform every element in society in a single generation? No. but did they make significant progress towards those Republican values that they espoused? Absolutely, they did. And so if you look at American history from that perspective, where you have the tragic nature of man, the tragic nature of society, you have these people entering into a historical moment in which the world looked very bleak in a lot of ways. They're bringing that level of civilization, I think, undoubtedly upward. And so you start from that premise where they see nothing but domination. They see nothing but negativity, nothing but a kind of parade of horrors. I think any honest looking at American history could say, absolutely, we've had a real history of racial injustice, a real history that has to be grappled with. But if you put it in the context of the highest ideals, from the Declaration to the Constitution to the speeches of Abraham Lincoln and the actions of Lincoln, you can see this kind of rising level of always moving towards the completion of or the realization of those highest ideals. So that's one thing. You look at it from a historical context. And then the second thing is you look at it in a comparative way, where you say, okay, let's even grant you, let's say your argument is true. These are rationalizations used for domination. What other system would you suggest? What other country would you proffer as a better alternative? You know, I started my career as a documentary filmmaker. And so over that, 10, 15 years of my first part of my career, I traveled to somewhere between 70, 75 different countries around the world. And so I got to see how pretty much all of the major population groups live, all of the major governing systems. And so I think we should be very careful when we say we're going to throw out the entire Western tradition. We're going to throw out the entire American tradition. We're going to throw out the entire system of capitalism, the entire system of constitutional government in pursuit of some vague and fuzzy utopia where we can really level society completely. And I think you ask them, well, what countries do it better? What countries would you rather model your society on? And then you start to actually have a practical view. So
let me push back against that a little bit. So, because I'm trying to do what I can to argue for the other side, let's say.
Sure.
So I might say, well, these Western countries that you point to as pillars of freedom and democracy and wealth, and in terms of, let's say, the remediation of absolute privation, the reason that a small minority of people within them are hyper successful is because they oppress and dominate the others in that society and siphon off excess resources from them in a manner that's akin to theft. That's a Marxist perspective. And then the reason that the United States and Canada and Great Britain, let's say, are wealthy in the manner that they are, has nothing to do with the essential virtues of capitalism and the free market, and everything to do with the fact that they took all the land from the native